Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for today's devotional moment. Today we're talking about hope runs on rails. Hal Lindsey says this: man can live about 40 days without food, about 3 days without water, about 8 minutes without air, but he can only go 1 second without hope. On July 21st in 1873, just outside of Adair, Iowa, a group of outlaws formulated a perfect robbery. Their idea was to derail a train that was carrying what they thought were a massive amount of gold bullion. And so their plan was to take a railroad spike out of the railroad, hitch up their horses to the tie that was underneath the railroad, and pull that tie out, and as soon as the train hit that rail, it would derail the train. So sure enough, they snatched the railroad tie out from underneath the trail. It derailed the train, and then they boarded the train to find the safe. When they popped the safe open, they cracked the safe, they found only $2,000 inside and no gold bullion as they had expected. And although the robbery itself wasn't a success, Jesse James and his gang went on to live in infamy in history, known as some of the very first outlaws of the Wild Wild West. What's interesting for us is this: the train that Jesse James and his gang derailed, it needed 2 rails to run on. And that really picks up the concept for today's devotional. We need 1 rail of reality. We can't just avoid reality of what things are going on in our lives and just have this almost overly positive, what some have called a toxic positivity, that we're just irrational and not even having our mind based in reality. We have to know reality. But we also have to have the other rail of hope. And so if our train of our life is going to move forward, it has to run on 2 rails and not get stuck at the end of the line. So we need to acknowledge the honesty of reality, but also look at the hope of heaven and of what's forward and what's to be hoped for and what God has for us in the future. And so when it comes to finding hope, we see Jeremiah. He has words of encouragement that he gave to the people who are stuck in Babylon. In Jeremiah 29, he gives them this encouragement for people who are stuck in captivity. And sometimes there's an interesting play on words there. Sometimes we can find ourselves, we are captivated by God, or we're captivated. That means it's a good, positive thing. But the flip side is we can be held captive. We can be held captive to things. So the people that Jeremiah was writing to, they looked at their situation as being held captive instead of being captivated by the opportunities God set before them. And so Jeremiah writes a letter to these people that are in captivity in Babylon, and he gives them a 4-fold roadmap, a way forward for hope in the midst of honesty in a difficult situation. He says, number 1 to them, settle down and build homes. No more living in tents. He says, find a little bit of permanency in your residency where you're living. Don't be looking for your ship to come in or for when you'll be able to get out of the situation. Number 2, he says, plant gardens and eat the fruit of your hands. No more fast food. He says, you're not going to get up and get out of here kind of like the Israelites back in the days of the Exodus, where they were ready to run on a moment's notice and get out of Egypt. He said, that's not God's plan for right now. Go ahead and plant your gardens. He says, number 3, go ahead and get married, settle down, have kids, raise your kids up and let them get married so you can have grandkids. There's this idea of permanency, of strengthen your relationships, and don't worry about settling down. And then he says, number 4, pray for the peace and prosperity of the city. If the city's successful, it's a win-win. It's mutually beneficial for you. If the city loses, you lose. It's mutually assured destruction. Sometimes we may not agree with what's going on in politics or government or what's happening in our community, but Jeremiah, what he tells them thousands of years ago, is the same encouragement for us today. Is whatever situation we're going through, pray for the peace and prosperity of the city or community that we live in. God's plan is for you and I, for his people. It's the same as what he had for them back in those days, is for a future and for a hope. And so there's an anticipation of good to come, and that's what hope running on rails means today. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to read more about this, you can find Jeremiah 29 verses 11 to 13 talks more in depth about the concepts we discussed today in the devotional. Thanks so much for watching.